Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on Mondi's approach to EUDR. Within the next hour, we want to guide you a bit on what EUDR is all about, what are the latest updates, what is the latest state, and how is Mondi approaching this. But we also want to make it clear what you have to do as a customer, so what your obligations are. In terms of speakers, my name is Michiel de Koolman. I'm sustainability specialist for craft paper. Also in the room, we have Susan Brunner, who is our head of product sustainability and positioning, and Jinrich Krejci, who is our paper sourcing and planning director. Before we jump into the specifics of EUDR, just very briefly on Mondi. So within Mondi, we have 3 business units: corrugated packaging, flexible packaging, and uncoated fine paper. This webinar is organized for flexible packaging. And there we are proud to say that we are the #1 craft paper producer globally. We are also the #1 paper bags producer in the world. And for consumer flexible packaging in Europe, we are on the 3rd place. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to Susan to tell us more about EUDR.
Thanks, Michiel. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. So we're going to go at a pretty rapid pace, but nonetheless, we want to start at the beginning and set the context, what the EU Deforestation Regulation is all about. The core aim of the EUDR is to reduce the impact of the EU on global deforestation and forest degradation, and to do this by regulating import, export, and trade within the EU. In essence, what you see on the right-hand side, it retains all of the obligations that were already in place under the EU Timber Regulation, which went into effect already in 2013. But it has a much broader scope today. So it covers multiple commodities, not just wood-based products. So cattle, cocoa, coffee, palm oil, rubber, soya, and wood, and any derivatives of that are all in scope of EUDR now. However, it only applies to fresh fiber products. This is a topic we'll come back to a couple of times in the course of the presentation. So if you are selling 100% recycled materials with no fresh fiber, no virgin fiber in there, it's not in scope. And again, it's also only applicable for paper and packaging, which is being sold. So as such. So it's not for packaging on products, pallets, or transport packaging. So once you have a finished product put into a paper-based packaging, it's no longer in scope. But we will come back to that again. So starting at the beginning, the heart of the EUDR is, of course, requires to do proper due diligence to be sure that there is no impact on deforestation and forest degradation. And you must do this due diligence before you buy or sell a product. And so we've outlined here 6 key steps in this process. The first is to appoint a compliance officer on a management level for your organization. The second step is to collect the fiber origin data from your suppliers. It can be through the due diligence statements referencing the data in the system, or if they're not in the system, then the geolocation data. The third step is to collect verifiable evidence that those products are deforestation free and legally sourced. The fourth step is to conduct a risk assessment and take mitigation measures to address any risks that have been identified, and to submit a due diligence statement for each product that you're selling, and assume, of course, the legal liability that it is deforestation and forest degradation free. And last but not least, there's an annual reporting requirement under EUDR after the first year of implementation. So in terms of the EUDR implications, it is significant. So in terms of the potential penalties, it is up to 4% of a company's total annual EU turnover. It is also could be being banned from public procurement or confiscation of those goods, etc. So it is significant. It went into force already on the 29th of June, 2023, with required compliance now for medium and large companies by the end of this year. So by the 30th of December, 2025. That was extended. It was initially the end of last year. Small and micro companies, some of whom may be our customers, have an additional 6 months for compliance under EUDR. And the definition for the small and micro enterprises is less than 50 employees and a less than 10 million turnover and balance sheet. Most of the content that we're going to share with you today is not targeted for, or is not, I'd say, tailored for SMEs. It's rather for non-SME entities. Yeah. So let's go to the deliverables from the Commission. So what is the information that we have received from the European Commission in terms of guidance on implementation? Their latest information was published in April of this year, included a guidance document, FAQ, so frequently asked questions, and also a draft delegated act, which is aiming at reducing administrative burdens under the regulation. We have included the links in the deck, which we will send out to you after the webinar so you can access all the information. Also, a second big deliverable was the country risk benchmarking, which is quite recent. It was published in the journal in June of this year, so this month. And we're going to come to that again, but all EU member states, Canada, the US, and South Africa are classified as low risk. Those are all of our key sourcing areas. And last but not least, in terms of the deliverables, we have the national competent authorities. All have been nominated across the EU with the exception of Poland, Malta, and Greece. On the right-hand side, you can still see as well the traces system. That is the backbone of the EUDR. It's the information system where all of the information and the due diligence statements needs to be uploaded. We are working in the system, testing the functionality and with our systems together. There is training material available from the European Commission, so we've included the links here for anyone who wants to look into that for themselves, as well as the user guide. So when it comes to the country risk benchmarking, because this is quite new, we also wanted to do a little bit of a deeper dive on this one. As I said, it's just come out. It is important because the risk levels, of course, have a big impact on the due diligence requirement. Lower risk means that you have a simplified due diligence. You have less that you need to do. There are 3 country risk classifications in the country risk benchmarking: low, standard, and high risk. Low risk has been defined for 140 countries, including the EU, US, Canada, China, for example. Standard risk is about 50 countries, and high risk, just 4 countries have been defined: Belarus, Myanmar, North Korea, and Russia. That means, of course, you have to have the strictest compliance checks in a high-risk country. And we want to emphasize the fact that a low risk classification does not mean that you don't need to do anything, that you don't have to collect the data and do any kind of due diligence. You still need to address risks there. For example, what we've included on the slide here, risks of mixing sources, for example, or potential circumvention of the legislation. Here we again wanted to just put it a little bit into context of Mondi's operation. You see on the map on the right-hand side, those are in the green, the main regions where we source our wood fiber, our fresh fiber. And also you see the purple triangles are our fresh fiber mills. And we also have 2 recycled container board mills. However, as I mentioned, 100% recycled materials are not in scope of EUDR. So we as Mondi can say, we take a risk-based approach, and we know that around 90% of our total sourcing is from the countries where our mills are located. And you see here, we've also, again, listed our main sourcing countries that makes up that 90%. And so we are confident in saying to our customers that 100% of our wood is responsibly sourced and from countries that we now see are classified as well as low risk in the European Commission country risk benchmark. So now we come back again a little bit to the overall requirements under EUDR and what kind of information you can expect to see that would need to be included in a typical due diligence statement. So starting at the top in the online due diligence statement, the typical information you would expect about the company name and address, and also potentially for those that would be registering from outside of the EU, a so-called EORI number. Then information on the product, which would include this combined nomenclature code, and we will touch on that again in a minute. The trade name and description, and of course also the species names of the trees, and also the quantity of product being sold. On the wood fiber origin, you will find the country of production, And most likely you will find reference numbers to the upstream due diligence statements when they are in the system. Should those materials not yet be on the market, then you potentially would also receive geolocation data in the due diligence statement. And last but not least, a compliance statement about formal EUDR compliance and a signature. And then in terms of internal company records, what would also need to happen here in terms of collecting the data is, of course, each company should have the contact details of their suppliers and their customers, and also the information related to the time range of the production of those commodities, and all the evidence that's been gathered to show that these products have been made deforestation free and legally produced. And those records should be kept for 5 years. So if I think about, if we look at the traceability requirements, there is a distinction between EU-based entities and non-EU-based entities. And the core difference is, of course, those within the EU have access to the Traces NT system, so the information system where all the information should be uploaded. Those outside would not have direct access to Traces NT. So we've tried to here just capture briefly what those requirements are. So if we think about actors within the EU who have access to the system, the first actor placing the wood products on the market has to create a due diligence statement in the EU Traces system, including the geolocation of all the relevant forest plots. From the EU Traces system, then a reference number and a verification number will be generated for each online due diligence statement that can be shared with the next actor in the value chain. My colleague is going to walk you through this in an illustrated way as well in just a second. And then, further, as the next step, then the non-SME, we made it very clear here, so it's about non-SME operators and non-SME traders, still have a requirement, though, to ascertain that due diligence has been properly done before they submit their own due diligence statements here and purchase those products with the reference and verification numbers in the system. So it sounds a little complicated. It is a little complicated, but I think we've shown it in a very simple way in the following slides. If I come now to the actors outside of the EU who don't have access to the Traces system, we want to again state here, there are no obligations for actors outside of the EU who are not importing, exporting, or doing any kind of trade in the EU. If you have customers along the value chain, they may still ask for traceability data if they're outside the EU, if those products ultimately, at the end of the day, end up being traded on the EU market. And in that case, you would have to supply the traceability data and information about risk mitigation and pass that along the supply chain to the company that's putting goods on the market, on the EU market. And those outside of the EU can apply for an economic operators registration and identification number, so-called EORI number. And with this, they can go into the Traces system and register these goods for import. So I think the next page, I will be handing over to my colleague Jindrich.
Good afternoon to everybody. It's really a pleasure to be here, and let me explain you briefly the technical solution Mondi is going to implement to cope with EUDR process requirements. And let's start with our paper mills. As Susan already mentioned, we source in big extent our fibers in the country of our mills, and with exception of South Africa, we actually source it via sourcing organizations or our partners on the wood sourcing side. From EUDR perspective process, it means that there is already actor upstream in the supply chain, and therefore we receive our fibers already with due diligence statement reference number of this actor and verification number from there. These data we use as an input data to our process, and we properly store them for later use. Internally in the paper mills, considering the mass production and character of the technology, we've decided to go for algorithm based on the so-called timestamp, or in other words, you could call it as a throughput time, which we have properly defined for each and individual paper grade we produce. This timestamp consists of time we have for storage of fibers, chips, wood, and purchased pulp in our mills, production time of the paper, and if relevant for make to stock, take from stock process, also storage time. And the algorithm works the way that at the moment when we release the order production order we release for production process, we trigger the search logic, we go back, and based on the timestamp, we pick up from the input database relevant numbers we got from our suppliers. We add them to our due diligence statement, which we submit to the EU traces. And as a response, we receive our own due diligence statement reference number and verification number. And these two numbers are then assigned to all deliveries related to this respective production order. We provide it together with delivery information and delivery documents to our customers. So that would be the paper production side. And now let's move to converting area. You can see there also start of the process, which we've already described for paper mills. Basic logic is the same and it's fully in line with the EUDR requirements. Nevertheless, on converting side, we've got already one advantage, and our converting units are able to assign properly the paper received from the paper production to respective production orders on their side. So we could say full traceability process. So that there is again clear assignment of purchased paper and the reference the reference number and verification number received with the paper to production order, ergo sales order, which we then deliver to our customers. And as regards customers, there are in principle 3 possibilities which can happen on customer side, where one of them means that our part would be end of the EUDR process and EUDR obligations. And that's exactly the case when customer is already selling the product on the market, which is not EUDR relevant, and packaging paper or paper-based packaging, which we supply, is really used as a packing material only. There are 2 other options, and we will describe it also on the next slide, when there is where EUDR obligation still stays also with our customers. Direct obligation in terms of EUDR, it's kind of summary. So it means that actually there are selling products listed in Annex 1 of the EUDR regulation, including paper goods with the fresh, and it's really important to mention, with fresh wood fiber content. Second one, import. Obviously, if our customer is in the role of the one who imports the goods to the EU market, meaning actually the first entity which is placing such a EUDR relevant products mentioned in Annex 1, placing on EU market, there is again the obligation. And third one is re-import of these EUDR relevant products. In all these cases, full scope of EUDR requirements is valid. Issue the due diligence statement, which contains all the relevant data. Proceed with risk assessment and risk mitigation, and store all the documentation for 5 years. On the other hand, on the right side of the slide, you can see that cases when there is not any longer EUDR obligation at place. As I said, selling the products which are not a paper packaging, meaning they have different CN codes than those which are relevant for a regulative. They are not products not listed in Annex 1. Packaging solely used for transport purposes. Selling and importing only recycled paper. Again, that's the note about the fresh fibers. And selling used transport packaging to other companies, typically pallets. So then actually these are cases when there is no obligation any longer. When it comes to timetable, obviously start from the end. We have to be, and we are committed to be fully compliant with EUDR by end of 2025 with all internal procedures. As you can see on the timetable, we are in the middle of pilot testing and actually testing IT solution, as I described very roughly, for both for paper mills and converting units. Very quickly, we will start the testing with selected suppliers, because that's one of the big challenging areas. And later on, we will be also offering the possibility to test with selected customers. And towards the Q4, our aim is to start with pilot operations in full scope with selected partners, test the whole process end to end to be sure that by the end of 2025, we are fully ready to be compliant in all aspects relevant for EUDR. And with that, I'm happy to hand over back to Suzanne.
Thank you very much. So we have a couple of questions that we've already prepared to kick off the conversation, and these are questions that we've very often gotten from our customers in the last year or so. So let's jump right in. Look at the first question. First question clearly is, are the goods that we're buying from you, dear Mondi, in scope of EUDR? And here there's a very clear decision tree to help you determine that. The first question is, are you producing or trading products that are listed under this CN codes 44, 47, 48, 49? You can see on the right-hand side, we've provided, you can find these CN codes listed in Annex 1 under the EUDR. We've included the link and also pulled that out for you so that you can see it's the relevant CN codes for fiber-based packaging and paper are related to wood and articles of wood, wood pulp, paper and paperboard for Chapter 48, and printed books, newspapers, and other printed products under Chapter 49, for example. So you'll look at that, and if you say, no, none of the products I produce or trade are listed in this Annex 1, then you have no obligations. If yes, the next question again is, do any of these products have virgin wood fiber, fresh fiber in their product composition? If the answer is no, it's 100% recycled content, no obligations. If the answer is yes, are you importing the products to the EU, selling or trading in the EU? If you're acting outside of the EU, no obligations. Within the EU, EUDR obligations apply. And one more time, these exemptions from the EUDR scope. A notable exemption is also bamboo-based products, not so relevant for us at Mondi, but in principle, this is one of the exemptions under the scope. This paper with 100% recycled content, also sometimes called paper for recycling, and packaging on products. And at this point, we wanted to unpack a little bit more. If we go to the next page, I think I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Michiel.
Yes, thank you, Susan. Another question that we often get from our customers is if EUDR applies to all product packaging. And here the answer is that it actually really depends on what you are selling. And it's important to know that there are no requirements if a company sells products which are not subject to the EUDR, even when those products are packed in paper-based packaging. So that may sound a bit strange or complicated, so we provided a few examples. First example being paper ice cream cones. So basically, if you are selling the paper cones themselves, so the empty paper cones, you are selling a paper-based product, so you are subject to the EUDR. If you are, however, selling a scoop of ice cream in a biscuit that is in a paper cone, you are selling the ice cream and the biscuit. You are not necessarily selling the paper cone, so you are out of scope of the EUDR. Another example to make this clear is our Advantage stretch wrap. This is our in-house solution to wrap pallets. So basically, if we as Mondi are selling the Advantage stretch wrap paper reel, then we are subject to the EUDR. But the pallet on which the paper reel is laying, it's a wooden pallet, let's say, but this is out of scope. because we are not selling this wooden pallet, we are selling the paper reel. If you as a customer are producing PET bottles and you are using our advantage stretch wrap to wrap your PET bottles, and then you sell those PET bottles, you are again out of scope of the EUDR, because what you're selling really are the PET bottles and not the packaging around. Two more examples to make this extra clear. The third one being an e-commerce mailer bag example. If your company is selling the empty mailer bags, again, you are selling paper packaging, so you are subject to the EUDR. If you are, however, putting, for example, sweaters in those mailer bags and you are selling the sweaters, you are out of scope. And the last example is linked to our paper bag industry. Again, if we as Mondi, for example, or you as a customer are selling empty paper bags, you are subject to the EUDR. If you are receiving the paper bags, you are filling them with cement and you are selling this cement, you are out of scope of the EUDR and you don't have direct obligations. So I hope that this difference is clear and that it's also clear that it really depends on what you're selling and what's on your invoice. And with that, I would like to hand over back to Susan.
Thanks. I think those are really great examples. The next question is that we've received is whether we've assessed and looked at EUDR related risks in our supply chain. And the answer to this is a very clear yes. We have assessed those risks as part of our due diligence management system, called our DDMS, that's been around for a very long time, quite mature. And here we have very clearly defined that we do not accept wood from areas associated with violation of national legislation, deforestation, forest degradation, or violation of indigenous peoples' rights. We, of course, now are looking at the EU Commission's country risk benchmarking and embedding this into our DDMS systems as well. And sometimes we also get asked by customers, well, how are we doing that? How are we addressing these risks and what kinds of risks are we addressing? So you see on the right-hand side, we've highlighted in purple 4 different types of risk that we identify and look and assess when we are doing our due diligence. The first one is around illegal practices, where we look at a number of different sources. For assessing that risk, it could be the Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index of a particular country, the World Bank Worldwide Governance Indicators, or FSC's National Risk Assessments, for example. We also look specifically, of course, in terms of deforestation degradation. Now, the resource to reference is the EU Commission Country Risk Benchmarking. We previously also looked at national risk assessments and so on as well there. And then also have to address potential supply chain complexity. So we need to evaluate the risk of mixing of products that might originate in a high or standard risk countries, or whether that all of that supply is from low risk countries. And then the last part is around any other kinds of risks that might be highlighted by environmental NGOs in the media brought to our attention. Could also be import and export bans or international sanctions lists, those types of things. So multiple aspects that we consider in our due diligence management system. So this is, I would say, probably the number one question last year. It has now changed a little bit now that we've got more clarity in black and white also from the European Commission and their latest guidance. So the question is always, will you share geolocation data with us from all of your suppliers of all the raw materials? The answer is that we will provide what is required under the legislation, which is the reference numbers and the verification numbers. We will do this latest as of the compliance deadline at the end of this year. But as my colleague Jindrich already showed, we will be already doing some testing with select customers into Q3 ahead of the compliance deadline. Yeah, so it's very clearly stated in the latest guidance that the geolocation data for downstream that does not need to be shared all with downstream customers, but it has to be uploaded to the Traces NT system by the suppliers, particularly and including the geolocation coordinates for those at the beginning of the supply chain. We will provide those reference and verification codes in our due diligence statements, and these are linked to the data submitted by the suppliers, as I mentioned before. And it's a little bit related to the transition period. I am going to come to this in another question. The transition period for commodities on the market, because the requirements differ depending on whether those commodities, those products were first, or the raw materials to make those products were first put on the market before EUDR goes into effect or becomes applicable at the end of this year, or before. Yeah. So any products that are put on the market during this transition period, which is anytime before the end of this year, they will receive a conventional due diligence reference number, or they will be able to use that. That's being provided by the Commission, and that's for export or re-import procedures for products in this transition period. That means that the wood was harvested before the end of this year, but perhaps those finished products are being traded and sold or imported or exported after the end of this year. Yes, so because the transition period is a bit complex, we thought we would break it down for you one more time in a little bit more detail, because the obligations depend on that. Yeah. So starting with the first point, if the raw materials are being sold or imported during this transition period, which again is from mid-June 2023 until the end of this year, then the finished goods made from those raw materials are actually not subject to EUDR obligations. They fall under EU Timber Regulation. This means that there is no due diligence statement that's required, and all of those additional processes and documentation are not required, even when those products are being sold after the 30th of December. For any raw materials or finished goods that fall into those HS codes that we touched on before, that are then imported to the EU after the end of this year, they have to comply with EUDR requirements. Yeah, imports before the 30th of December would fall under, again, EUTR obligations. And any products that are brought back into the EU, so re-imported, they were initially in the EU, sold or traded outside of the EU and then come back in. But if they were originally in the EU market in this transition period, so before the end of this year, then these conventional reference numbers, as we mentioned before, will be used for the customs authorities. And so you have no obligation for a due diligence statement. And we've tried to illustrate this at the bottom as well, so that you can see, we say we have the harvesting and the wood is on the market before the end of this year in the first line, and then it goes into manufacturing, potentially converting and so on. There are no EUDR obligations, only EU Timber Regulation requirements. If the product was made entirely from those materials in the transition period. If there's a mixture with other materials that went onto the market after the compliance deadline, so outside of the transition period, then no. And then on the bottom, you see if the harvesting was happening before the end of this year, but the wood only went on the market, was placed on the market after the end of this year, after the 30th of December, then EUDR obligations apply. So if we say you don't have to have all of the obligations in this transition period, then of course the next question logical is, well, how do I show, what's the evidence that I need that a product was on the market, or the raw materials to make that product was on the market before the 30th of December this year, so that you have that simplified requirements. Products placed on the market before the end of this year have certain kinds of documentation that can be used as evidence. This has been provided by the European Commission. They've given suggestions for what that evidence could look like. It could be anything from a customs declaration for the import of those goods, production documentation, delivery notes, invoices showing the transfer between different entities, or even CRM way bills, etc., for the transportation of those goods. So we wanted to reiterate again here. So what does that really mean at the end of the day? That means that in all of the shipping and delivery documents that we issue after the end of this year, after the 30th of December 2025, for customer orders, you will find one of three things. You will find either a reference number and verification number to the online due diligence statement in Traces NT, or you will find a conventional DDS reference number being used in the case of export or re-import of products that were placed on the market during the transition period, because for those products there are no due diligence statement requirements, therefore no numbers that could be used. And the third alternative is that you could see or alternatively, a confirmation that these goods were made entirely from commodities or products placed on the market before EUDR was applicable. And then these evidence that we show you on the left would come into play, potentially, if required. So I'm going to hand back to Michiel for a summary.
Yes, thank you. So to summarize this session, the key takeaways, market participants and non-SME traders must be compliant with the EUDR by the end of the year, so by the 30th of December 2025. And we as Mondi will also be compliant by this date. We will use the EU Traces system to generate the needed reference numbers and verification numbers. And those numbers will be passed on throughout the whole value chain, let's say, so really starting at wood sourcing until the end customer. And we as Mondi, we will share the reference numbers and verification numbers separately in the delivery documents as needed with our customers. And the last point that I wanted to mention is that we're not just a legal company, but we also have a strong reputation for sustainability by, for example, committing to zero deforestation and sourcing 100% of our wood fiber from responsible sources. So we are not sourcing any non-controlled wood. And with that, I would like to thank all of you for attending this webinar. I hope it was useful. Also, thank you to Susan, thank you to Indrich, and wishing you a great day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.